You were the one on the bridge, weren't you? The judge's voice cut through the courtroom like a struck bell, and every head turned toward me. I stood at the plaintiff's table with no attorney beside me, my mother's restaurant hanging in the balance, while my half-brother's lawyer sat across the aisle with the easy posture of a man who'd already mentally cashed the check. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know what she meant. Then she said a date. A year. A flood. That's when my hands went cold, because I realized she wasn't making small talk from the bench. She remembered me. I didn't remember her at all. My name is Sofia Reyes. I'm 33, a paramedic with Savannah Chatham Ms, and 6 weeks earlier I had buried my mother, Isabel Reyes, thinking the hardest part of my year was already behind me. I was wrong. Mom had run a little Cuban-Southern fusion diner on the edge of downtown for 22 years. Isabel's table, tucked between a laundromat and a bail bonds office, the kind of place where the regulars had their own coffee mugs behind the counter. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't profitable in any way that would impress a banker. But it was hers, built from nothing after she came to Georgia with 2 suitcases and a recipe box, and it was the only thing she ever asked me to promise I'd take care of. Someday this is yours, mija, she used to say, wiping down the counter after close. Not for the money, for the name on the door. My mother's will was simple. The diner and the building it sat in went to me. Her modest savings were split between me and my half-brother, Marcus, her son from a marriage before mine, 12 years older, someone I'd grown up seeing twice a year at holidays and not much else. Marcus wasn't happy about the diner. At first I told myself it was grief talking. Then the calls started, then the letter from his attorney. Marcus claimed Mom had verbally promised him the business years earlier, back when he'd apparently helped keep it afloat during a rough stretch after her divorce. He said he'd covered payroll more than once. He said she depended on him. And then, through his lawyer, he filed a formal claim against the estate, supported by a document I had never seen in my life. The first time I read it, I actually laughed, thinking it had to be a clerical mix-up. My mother had never once mentioned Marcus owning any piece of that diner. Not once, in 33 years. I called 4 attorneys. One wanted a retainer that was more than 3 months of my take-home pay. One was booked solid until spring. One looked at the basic paperwork and told me, gently, that a contested probate case with a disputed document could get expensive fast, the kind of expensive that eats savings whole. I had some savings, but most of it was earmarked for the diner's roof, which had been threatening to leak since March. I kept calling. The hearing date arrived before I found anyone. So I walked into the Chatham County Courthouse alone. I wore the one gray suit I owned, my hair pulled back the way I wear it for 12-hour shifts, a folder of documents under my arm that felt thin the second I sat down. Across the room, Marcus sat beside his attorney, a tall man in an expensive tie who radiated the specific calm of someone who bills by the hour and has never lost sleep over a client's case. Marcus glanced at me once. Not angry, almost sorry, the kind of look you give someone when you've already decided how the story ends. His attorney spoke first. He told the judge that Marcus had made substantial, sustained financial contributions to the diner over the years and that Isabel Reyes had intended, before her death, to formally transfer partial ownership to her son. Then he produced a document. A 1-page ownership agreement. My mother's signature at the bottom. I stared at it. It looked right. It looked almost exactly like her handwriting, the same looping S in Isabel, the same small flourish under the last name. For a second, my chest went tight with something worse than anger. Doubt. Ms. Reyes, the attorney said, turning to me with practiced politeness, do you have counsel representing you today? No. I see. 2 words, and somehow they landed like an accusation. The judge looked at me over her glasses. Ms. Reyes, you understand you're representing yourself in this matter? Yes, Your Honor. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. She studied the document for a long moment, then looked up. Do you have evidence that contradicts this agreement? I opened my folder. Bank statements. The lease. Copies of the will. A stack of years-old emails between me and my mother about the business. Under the fluorescent lights of that courtroom, next to Marcus's crisp legal exhibits, it suddenly looked like exactly what it was, a grieving daughter's shoebox of paper. I looked over at Marcus. He wasn't smiling, but something in his shoulders had loosened, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying too long. Then the judge went quiet. When she spoke again, her tone had changed completely. Ms. Reyes, I looked up. You were the one on the bridge, weren't you? The room seemed to hold its breath. I shook my head slowly. I'm sorry, Your Honor. I don't understand. River Street. The flood. 4 years ago. The overpass by the old cotton exchange. She said it like she was reading it off a memory she'd never quite put down. A car went into the water. My pulse started hammering before my mind caught up to why. I knew that bridge. I knew that flood. I'd been on shift that night. But I still had no idea who she was. She glanced down at something in the case file. Not the file for this case, I realized. Something else, something personal she must have pulled before ever walking into court, and then back up at me. I need to make a disclosure before we go any further, she said. Marcus's attorney sat up straighter. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. The judge explained, calmly, to a courtroom that had gone completely silent, that she had encountered me once before, years earlier, under circumstances that had nothing to do with this case, but that she could not, in good conscience, allow that prior connection to influence these proceedings in either direction. Then she did something I never saw coming. She recused herself. Marcus's confident posture cracked for the first time all morning. The judge stood, gathered her folder, and before she left the bench, looked directly at me one more time. "There's something in this record," she said quietly, "that deserves a much closer look." And then she was gone. I sat there frozen, my folder of thin evidence still open on the table in front of me. I had walked into that courtroom certain I was about to lose my mother's diner. I walked out with no ruling, no lawyer, and no idea why a stranger from the bench had just looked at me like she owed me something. But for the first time since Marcus filed his claim, I didn't feel like I was standing at the end of my mother's story. I felt like I was standing at the beginning of a truth she'd never gotten the chance to tell me. The bridge the judge meant was on River Street, right where it dips under the old cotton exchange overpass, a stretch of road that floods every time Savannah gets more than 3 inches of rain in an hour. 4 years earlier, during the worst storm system the coast had seen in a decade, I'd been riding third shift with my partner, Devin, when dispatch sent us toward a possible water rescue. By the time we got there, a sedan had already gone off the shoulder into the rising water, nose down, back end still visible above the current. I remember the rain hitting so hard it stung. I remember wading in past my knees, then my waist, my radio already useless, screaming for someone to bring the cutters. There was a woman inside. Conscious. Trapped by a jam seatbelt and a door that wouldn't budge against the water pressure. "Please," she kept saying. "Please don't let go of me. I'm not going anywhere," I told her, and I meant it the way you only mean things in the middle of an emergency, when there's no room left for anything but the truth. I held her hand through the gap in the window and talked to her about nothing, her job, her kids, anything to keep her present instead of panicking, until the fire department got the door open and pulled her free. Paramedics from the second unit took over from there. I remember she grabbed my wrist right before they loaded her into the ambulance. "What's your name?" "Sofia." "Just Sofia," I'd laughed, soaked through, adrenaline still roaring in my ears. Just Sofia. Then the doors closed, and I never saw her again. Or so I thought, until I was sitting in a courthouse parking lot 4 years later, staring at my steering wheel, finally putting together that the woman trapped in that car and the judge who'd just recused herself from my case were the same person. Her name, I would later learn, was Judge Renata Vaughn. My phone buzzed. "Marcus, hope you're proud of the show you put on in there." I didn't answer. A second text followed almost immediately. "You should just settle. Save us both the embarrassment." I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat. For the first time, I understood something clearly. Marcus wasn't worried about losing. He was worried about what might happen if I kept digging. The case was reassigned to a new judge within the week. Marcus's attorney sent a settlement offer almost immediately. I'd sign away my claim to full ownership, accept a modest lump sum, and both sides would agree never to raise the matter again. I read it twice at my kitchen table, then thought about my mother wiping down that counter, saying someday this is yours, mija, for the name on the door. I wrote back one line, number. That night, I did what 12 years of M's work had trained into me when a situation felt chaotic. I built a timeline. Verified dates only. Mom bought the building in 2003. She and my stepfather divorced in 2014. She updated her will in 2019, right after her first cancer scare. Marcus claimed he'd started covering payroll shortfalls in 2015. But the bank statements I had told a different story. Every payroll gap I could find had been covered by transfers from my mother's own account, not his. I spread everything across the table: receipts, tax filings, lease renewals, old emails, and one detail stopped me cold. Marcus claimed he'd personally paid for a full kitchen renovation in 2018. But the invoice, when I found it, had been paid by check, drawn from an account with my mother's name on it, not his. I sat back in my chair. Why would you lie about something this easy to check? Then I noticed the date on the disputed ownership document itself, February 9, 2019. I knew that date. My mother had been in the hospital that week, a follow-up procedure after her diagnosis, 4 days. Admitted at Memorial. I dug out her old medical paperwork to be sure. February 9. Inpatient. Not at the diner. Not signing away half her life's work to her son. My hands went cold all over again. I called the one attorney who'd told me, weeks earlier, that he couldn't take the case. He agreed to give me 10 minutes on the phone. Do you have the original document? He asked, or just a copy? Just a copy. Then try to get the original if you can. And don't say the word forgery out loud to anyone yet. Why not? Because if you're right, you won't need to say it. The evidence will say it for you. The next morning I called Georgia Legal Aid and explained the situation. They couldn't take the whole case, but a staff attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand, agreed to review what I had. She held the disputed document up to the light, comparing it against an old birthday card my mother had signed. Your mother usually write her S like this. Yes, it's close. My stomach sank, until she kept going. Close isn't the same as authentic. She tapped the date. This medical record you mentioned might matter more than the handwriting does. Then she looked up. Who witnessed the signature? I checked the document. A name was printed beneath a signature line. Gloria Fenn. I knew that name. Gloria had bartended at Marcus's sports bar for years before it closed. Priya looked at me evenly. Find her. That night I searched old social media posts, an ancient staff directory I found archived online, anything. I found an address on the south side of town within an hour. I didn't know what I'd find when I knocked on Gloria Fenn's door. But I understood one thing clearly. My mother had spent her last years believing she'd protected that diner for me. I was about to find out exactly what my brother had built on top of her trust, and how far he was willing to go to make sure I never noticed. Gloria Fenn lived in a small brick duplex about 15 minutes off Ogeechee Road. I sat in my car across the street for a good 5 minutes before I made myself walk up to the door. I wasn't afraid of Gloria. I was afraid of what she might confirm. A woman in her 50s answered, drying her hands on a dish towel, reading glasses pushed up into graying hair. Can I help you? Are you Gloria Fenn? Her whole posture changed, some instinct kicking in before I'd even said my name. Who's asking? Sofia Reyes. Isabel Reyes's daughter. She stared at me for a long beat. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in. Her living room was small, cluttered in the comfortable way of someone who'd lived in one place a long time. She didn't offer coffee. I set a copy of the disputed ownership agreement on her coffee table. She looked at it without touching it. Where'd you get that? My brother's attorney submitted it in probate court. Her face went pale in a way that told me everything before she said a word. You recognize it? I said quietly. I recognize my own signature. She sat down heavily in the armchair across from me. I was afraid something like this would happen eventually. My pulse spiked. You witnessed this? I signed a paper Marcus brought me at the bar. He told me it was some ownership paperwork for the business, said he needed a witness signature for the bank. I didn't read the whole thing. I trusted him, he was my boss. Was my mother there when you signed it? No. Did you ever see her sign anything? No, Sophia, I never saw your mother at all that day. I sat back, something between relief and fury moving through my chest at the same time. Then why is your name on this as a witness to her signature? Gloria looked down at her hands. Because I trusted the wrong person, and I didn't ask enough questions. It was a sentence that hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. My mother had trusted the wrong person too, her own son. Gloria told me she'd left the bar job not long after, unrelated to any of this, and never once imagined that piece of paper would surface in a courtroom years later. Then she said something that made my stomach turn. Marcus asked me never to bring it up again. Said it would just cause problems. Problems for who? She didn't answer that directly. Instead she said, your mom was in the hospital around then, wasn't she? I remember Marcus mentioning it, said she was out of commission, and he needed to handle some paperwork while she was unavailable. I felt something cold settle into my spine. She was inpatient at Memorial that entire week. February 9th. I have the records. Gloria's eyes widened. Then this couldn't have happened the way that paper says it did. That's exactly what I think. I took a breath. Would you be willing to tell my attorney what you just told me? She hesitated only a second before nodding. Yes, I should have said something a long time ago. Before I left, she disappeared into a back room and returned with a small accordion folder, old pay stubs, tax forms, and a single spiral notebook she used to jot down shift notes and reminders. She flipped through it and stopped on a page. February 9th, bar closed early, M left around 3, no meeting with Isabel. I stared at the page like it might disappear if I blinked. That's the same day. I keep everything, Gloria said simply. Old habit. On the drive home, I kept turning her words over. I didn't ask enough questions. Maybe that was how family betrayals actually worked. Not one dramatic moment, but years of small silences, people convincing themselves that something wasn't really their problem to look into. When I got home, there was a text waiting from Marcus. Stop digging, Sofia, you're going to regret this. I didn't delete it. I took a screenshot and saved it to a folder labeled evidence. The next morning, I brought everything to Priya. She reviewed the notebook page, the medical records, and the disputed agreement side by side, her expression sharpening as she worked. This is significant, she said. Can we prove the document is outright fabricated? Not yet, but we may be able to prove it couldn't have been executed the way they're claiming. She tapped the bottom corner of the page. This needs a notary stamp, and it doesn't have one. Was there ever a notarized version filed? I hadn't even noticed. I went back through the court filing that afternoon and found it. A second page, attached separately, claiming notarization by a man named Edward Kessler. I searched his name and found he was still an active notary in Chatham County. When I called his office, he wouldn't discuss specifics without a subpoena, but he agreed to preserve his journal if it was formally requested. I passed that along to Priya. 2 days later she called me. Sofia, we found something in the notary journal. What is it? It doesn't match. Kessler's log for that week doesn't show any appointment with your mother at all. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. What does that mean for the case? It means we need to look a lot harder at how this document was actually created. A pause. There's something else. What? Gloria's signature. We had a document examiner do a preliminary comparison. It may not match her known signature from the same period. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I could see a path forward instead of just a wall in front of me. But 2 days later, Marcus's attorney filed a new motion, accusing me of harassing witnesses and attempting to manufacture evidence against my own brother. He wanted the court to dismiss my objection outright. At the next hearing, he looked straight at me across the aisle. You're chasing shadows, Ms. Reyes. I said nothing. Marcus leaned toward him and murmured something I couldn't hear. The attorney's smile came back. You're going to have to prove every piece of this, he said. I looked down at the folder in my lap, thicker now than it had been a month earlier, and for the first time since this began, I actually smiled. Because I finally understood. I didn't need to convince anyone of what I believed. I needed to prove it. And somewhere inside a notary's old logbook, my brother had left behind the one piece of the truth he'd forgotten to erase. The notary's journal changed everything, but it wasn't the last thing I found. 2 nights after Priya confirmed the mismatch, I went back to my mother's house, the small bungalow behind the diner where she'd lived for 2 decades, to keep sorting through the boxes I hadn't had the strength to touch since the funeral. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. I was looking for context. Some sense of who my mother had really been in the years I'd been too busy with my own life to notice everything. She had been meticulous, the way immigrant business owners often are, every receipt filed, every insurance document labeled by year. In the back of her closet, behind a stack of old cookbooks, I found a small fireproof lockbox I recognized from childhood but had never once seen opened. The key was taped to the underside of her jewelry box, exactly where she used to hide spare house keys when I was a teenager. Inside were old photographs, insurance papers, a folder of tax documents, and, at the very bottom, a sealed envelope with my name on it in her handwriting. Sofia, my hands were shaking before I even opened it. Mija, if you're reading this, something has happened that I hoped never would. I had to set the letter down for a moment before I could keep reading. I know your brother has asked about the diner more than once. I told him no every time. He helped me during hard years, and I will never say otherwise. But helping someone does not make them an owner of what is not theirs to own. I pressed my hand against my mouth. The next line broke something open in my chest. This place was never really about money, Mija. It was the first thing in this country that was fully, only mine. I want it to be the first thing that's fully yours. If Marcus ever challenges this after I'm gone, don't fight him because you hate him. Fight him because I'm asking you to protect what I built, not because of anger. At the very bottom of the box was a small digital voice recorder, the kind she'd bought years ago to record recipes for a cookbook she never finished. I plugged it into my laptop with hands that wouldn't quite stop trembling. There were several old recipe recordings, her voice, warm and unhurried, walking through her sofrito ratios. And then, dated less than a year before she died, one file simply labeled M. I pressed play. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Isabel. Marcus's voice. No, my mother answered, steady. I'm making it clear. You don't need this place, Marcus. Sofia does. She's never even here. She works nights, she barely stops in. She serves this whole city, running toward emergencies most people run away from. Don't mistake her being busy for her not caring. Silence. Then Marcus, quieter, almost desperate. I could lose the bar, Isabel. This could actually save me. I'm sorry for your trouble. I am. But this diner is not the answer to it. More silence. Then my mother again, firm in a way I recognized instantly, the same voice she used when a supplier tried to shortchange her on a delivery. If anything happens to me, the diner goes to Sofia. There is no version of this where that changes. The recording ended. I sat in the dark for a long time, not crying at first, just listening to it again. And again. Then I understood exactly why Marcus had gotten this desperate. He wasn't just trying to claim something he thought he deserved. He was trying to erase our mother's very last decision. The next morning I brought the recorder straight to Priya. She listened twice, her face unreadable. This could matter a great deal, she said. We'll need to authenticate the device and the voices properly, no shortcuts. But yes, this helps. I nodded, still numb. There's something else we need to look into, she added. What? Marcus might have already known about this recording existing. What do you mean? If he knew your mother had documented that conversation, that gives him a motive to manufacture something that looked like it overrode her wishes. The pieces were falling into place, but one question still didn't fit. Why had a judge I'd never met recognized me specifically, in open court, on a completely unrelated case? That afternoon, a formal court notice arrived regarding Judge Renata Vaughn's recusal. Attached was the original incident report from the River Street flood rescue, 4 years earlier, filed by the fire department, forwarded as part of her disclosure. I read through it slowly. Near the bottom, under, additional parties present at scene, was a name I didn't expect. Marcus Reyes. I stared at it until the letters stopped making sense. Why had Marcus been at that accident scene? And why had the judge remembered me, but never once mentioned him? I called Priya immediately. There's something in this report you need to see. What is it? My brother was at the accident scene the night I pulled that woman out of the water. The same night the judge who recused herself is talking about. There was a long pause on the line. Sofia, she said slowly, then we need to find out exactly why. I looked down at my mother's letter, still sitting open on the table. For the first time, I understood that this fight had never really started with the diner. The diner might only be the last chapter of something that had started years earlier, and I was finally getting close enough to see the whole shape of it. The final hearing began at 9 o'clock on a humid Thursday morning. By then, I'd stopped being afraid. Not because I was certain of the outcome, but because I finally understood something my mother had taught me without ever putting it into words. When the truth is actually on your side, you don't need to raise your voice. You just need to make it impossible to look away from. I walked into the Chatham County Courthouse carrying the same folder I'd carried weeks earlier, except now it was 3 times as thick. Inside, the will, the hospital records, the notary journal discrepancy, Gloria's signed statement, the document examiner's comparison, and my mother's voice recording, its chain of custody carefully documented by Priya's office. Priya sat beside me this time, not full representation, but present for the parts of the case that mattered most. Across the aisle, Marcus sat next to his attorney. The attorney still looked composed. Marcus didn't. He kept glancing at the folder in my hands like it might detonate. The new judge, a calm, unhurried man named Judge Okafor, called the hearing to order. Marcus's attorney opened first, restating the same argument, that Isabel Reyes had intended to transfer partial ownership to her son, that my objections were the actions of a grieving daughter unable to accept her mother's financial decisions. Then he added, almost carelessly, Your Honor, Ms. Reyes seems determined to turn a straightforward inheritance dispute into an accusation against her own brother. I stood when the judge nodded to me. My objection isn't about what I believe my mother wanted, I said. It's about what the evidence shows. I submitted the hospital records first. Marcus shifted in his seat. Then the notary journal, showing no record of any appointment matching the disputed document's date. Then Gloria took the stand. She confirmed, calmly and without hesitation, that Marcus had brought her paperwork to sign at the bar, that she'd never witnessed my mother sign anything, and that she'd never even seen my mother that day. When Marcus's attorney tried to suggest she might simply be misremembering after so many years, Gloria looked at him evenly and said, "I forget where I put my glasses sometimes. I don't forget being asked to lie for my boss." A few people in the gallery shifted audibly. Then Priya submitted the recording. Marcus's face changed the moment he saw the device on the evidence table. He knew exactly what it was. The courtroom went still as my mother's voice filled the room, steady and unmistakable. "If anything happens to me, the diner goes to Sofia. There is no version of this where that changes." Then Marcus's own voice, quieter, more desperate than I'd ever heard him. "I could lose the bar, Isabel. This could actually save me." When it ended, nobody spoke for what felt like a full minute. Marcus's attorney requested time to challenge the authenticity of the recording. The judge granted a short continuance for proper forensic review. No shortcuts, exactly as Priya had promised, but before the hearing adjourned, Judge Okafor turned to Marcus directly. "Mr. Reyes, do you dispute that this is your voice on the recording?" Marcus's attorney leaned toward him, whispering something urgent. Marcus stared at the table for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "You do not dispute it." "No, Your Honor. His voice cracked. "I didn't think she'd ever find it. I felt something in my chest give way, not triumph, exactly. Something closer to grief." During the recess, Marcus found me alone in the hallway outside the courtroom. "You don't understand what it's been like," he said, his voice low. "I understand you tried to take the one thing Mom ever asked me to protect. I helped her, Sofia. For years. Nobody ever thanked me the way they thanked. That's not why you did this," I said. "You did this because you thought losing to me proved something about who she loved more." "She didn't love either of us more, Marcus. She just made a decision about her own building." He didn't answer that. He looked, in that moment, less like the confident man from the first hearing and more like someone finally out of road. The final ruling came 3 weeks later, after the recording's authenticity was confirmed and the document examiner testified that Gloria's signature on the disputed agreement didn't match samples from the same period. The judge rejected the agreement outright, denied Marcus's claim, and confirmed the diner passed to me under the valid will. I didn't celebrate. I sat there in the gallery and simply closed my eyes. Outside the courthouse, Marcus caught up to me one more time. His eyes were red. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that doesn't fix what I did." "No," I said, "it doesn't." He nodded, and then asked the one thing I never expected. "Can I see the diner one more time? Before everything's official?" I thought about it longer than I expected to. Then I said, "Yes. We didn't hug that day. Some things need more time before they can be touched again." But he stood at the counter my mother had wiped down 10,000 times, ran his hand along the edge of it, and said, "She used to let me sit right here and do homework after school, before you were even born." "I didn't know that," I said. "There's a lot you don't know." He looked at me, something almost like relief crossing his face. "And a lot I need to be honest about. Starting with why I was really on that bridge the night you pulled that woman out of the water." I went very still. "You were there." He nodded slowly. "I was following her car that night, Sofia. Long story, a bad one, involving money I owed and people I shouldn't have borrowed from. I saw the accident happen right in front of me. I panicked and I left before anyone arrived. I've never told anyone that. I think Judge Vaughn recognized me in that report and recognized you as the one who actually stayed." I stood there in my mother's diner, absorbing one more piece of a story that had turned out to be so much bigger than a disputed piece of paper. A few weeks after that, I got a short letter in the mail from Judge Renata Vaughn. It wasn't about the case at all. She wrote about the flood, about being terrified and trapped, about a stranger's hand refusing to let go of hers in the middle of rising water. She wrote that she'd never learned my last name that night, never known if she'd see me again, but she'd never forgotten my face, or the sound of someone saying I'm not leaving like they meant it with their whole body. She hadn't helped me win my case. She'd simply recognized who I was and stepped aside so the case could be decided fairly. That distinction, I came to understand, mattered more than almost anything else in this whole ordeal. I kept the diner open. I kept my mother's coffee mugs behind the counter. I kept the ugly mint green paint on the back wall that she'd loved and everyone else had hated. And I added one thing, a small corkboard by the register where regulars could pin photos of their own families, because I finally understood what my mother had actually built all those years. Not just a business, a place people came back to. I still think about that morning in court, the folder of thin evidence in my lap, certain I was about to lose everything. I think about the judge looking at me and asking a question that had nothing to do with the case in front of her. For a long time I believed that question changed my life because a stranger remembered my face. Now I know it changed my life because it reminded me exactly who I wanted to be, long before I ever walked into that courtroom. My mother didn't leave me a diner so I could win a war against my own brother. She left it to me because she trusted me to protect what mattered without becoming someone I wouldn't recognize in the process. Maybe that's the real inheritance. Not the building. Not the name on the door. Just a quiet lesson about who to become when life gives you every reason to become bitter instead.